The invitation never came, but the silence did. It arrived slowly, like dust settling on an empty room, telling me something had been decided without me. I am a mother who learned too late that absence can speak louder than words. Our house stood at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by fields that had watched my daughter grow up, laugh, and slowly drift away. When I realized I had been excluded from her wedding, it wasn't anger that took hold first. It was a deeper unease, the feeling that something long buried was beginning to breathe again. The mailbox made a hollow sound when I lifted the lid. Not empty exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lingers longer than it should. Across the road, Mrs. Calder's roses leaned into the evening light, their shadows stretching like they knew something I didn't. She stood by her fence, waving gently, her mouth already forming words before she crossed over. I remember thinking how slow her steps were. As if she needed time to choose the right sentence. As if she already knew it would land heavy. I had just put the kettle on. It hadn't started singing yet, but the house felt alert, like it was listening. Mrs. Calder smiled when she reached me. Not a wide smile. Just polite. Careful. "Did you see the pictures?" she asked. I shook my head. I thought maybe she meant the weather. Or the new sign by the highway. Something ordinary. "Your daughter looked beautiful," she said. "The wedding, I mean." The word wedding didn't echo. Drop. Right there between us. I don't remember what I said after that. Something small. Something automatic. I nodded, I think. My hands folded into each other the way they always do when I'm trying to stay still. She realized then. Could see it. Her eyes softened, like she'd stepped on something fragile without meaning to. "Oh," she said quietly. "I thought you knew." I watched her walk back across the road. The roses swallowed her again. The kettle began to whistle inside the house, sharp and insistent, like it was angry I hadn't been listening. I turned it off without pouring the water. That evening I sat at the small kitchen table. The one by the window. The one my daughter used to sit at when she was younger, feet swinging, asking questions she already knew the answers to. The light outside faded slowly. The sky held on longer than usual. I thought back through conversations the way one flips through old photographs. Not looking for beauty, just evidence. Something I missed. Tone. Was. A moment where her voice changed and I didn't notice. I remembered her last visit. How she hugged me quickly like she was late for something else. How she talked about work. About traffic. About nothing that lingered. She didn't mention a date. She didn't mention a dress. The house creaked as the temperature dropped. It always does that around dusk. Tonight it sounded like a question. I stood and went to the front door. The mailbox sat where it always had, paint chipped, flag slightly bent. I opened it again, though I already knew. Just a grocery flyer. A folded bill. No thick envelope. No careful handwriting. No invitation softened by time and distance. I held the lid open a second longer than necessary. Then closed it gently like I didn't want to wake something. Later I found myself standing in the hallway. The one lined with photographs. Birthdays. School plays. One picture from years ago. My daughter in a white dress, holding flowers she'd picked herself, smiling like the world hadn't taught her anything sharp yet. I touched the frame. The glass was cool. I wondered when the story changed. Not the facts, just the version of me she carried. Somewhere along the way, I must have become someone who wouldn't want to come. Someone who didn't need to be asked. That realization settled slowly. Heavier than anger. Heavier than sadness. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the clock. Each tick landed cleanly, evenly. Time doing what it always does, whether we're ready or not. I imagined the wedding. The chairs lined up. The music starting. Her walking forward, eyes fixed on someone else now. I wondered if she looked for me. Or if she had already accepted the empty space where I would have been. The silence answered nothing. But it didn't leave either. Before going to sleep, I checked the mailbox one last time. Night had settled fully now. The road was quiet. No cars. No voices. I stood there longer than I meant to. Hand resting on the cool metal. It felt deliberate somehow. like the absence itself had been chosen carefully, placed gently, so it wouldn't bruise too loudly. Inside, the house waited, patient, knowing. I turned off the porch light and closed the door, carrying the question with me, not yet ready to ask it out loud. What had been kept from me? And who decided I didn't need to know? The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should. I sat at the kitchen table, light from the single bulb above casting shadows across old photographs. They leaned slightly in the frames, as if they had been watching too long and were tired of waiting. I dialed the first number slowly. The line clicked. Was a familiar voice on the other end. Warm, polite, careful. And yet, I could already feel the space between us had grown. I tried to speak, but the words didn't come easily. Hello. I heard about the wedding, I said finally. They hummed quietly. A sound meant to fill the silence but somehow stretching it, pulling it taut. Yes. Yes, it was beautiful, they said, soft, too soft. I felt the pause linger. Long enough for me to hear the unspoken. I moved to the window. The street outside was empty. Trees swayed with a late afternoon breeze, leaves brushing against each other like hushed whispers. I thought about my daughter, about the way she used to run across this very yard, calling my name, a giggle trailing behind her. And now, the yard was empty. My calls unanswered. My presence forgotten, maybe even unwanted. Each call I made followed the same pattern. Familiar voices, gentle tones, yet careful to avoid the subject. She's doing well, very happy. But never a hint, never an acknowledgement. As though the wedding existed in a parallel world where I had no place. I felt the house around me, old floorboards creaking like they remembered my uncertainty. The kettle whistled in the background, sharp against the soft hum of voices. I didn't move to turn it off. Couldn't. I was listening. The next call was to an aunt. I imagined her knitting in the living room, sun spilling across her lap, a cat curled at her feet. Yes, she's grown up so fast, she said, voice gentle, distant. I asked, Did she want me there? The line went quiet, longer than before. The soft rustle of fabric. Well, I think she thought you wouldn't come, she said finally. I sat down heavily. The floorboards groaned in sympathy. Called again. Old friends. Family I hadn't spoken to in months. Every answer was the same. Gentle, careful, almost rehearsed. No one thought you'd be coming. Didn't you know? Things got complicated. Complicated. The word hung in the air like smoke. I remembered moments from years ago. Conversations I replayed, trying to see what had shifted. Passing comment. Tone misread. A smile I thought was warm, now cold in hindsight. Why had everyone agreed on this? I couldn't place blame. Not yet. But the thought sank in quietly, a weight pressing against my chest. By evening I was walking through the house. Each room carried memories. The living room where we had movie nights. The hallway where she had learned to walk. The bedroom where I had tucked her in countless nights. I ran my hand along the walls. The wallpaper felt rough beneath my fingers. The house smelled faintly of tea and old wood. I realized then the full scope of it. Not just the wedding, but the absence, the quiet agreement. The way everyone had silently rewritten the story of me. My daughter, my family, even the friends I trusted. They had all assumed I wouldn't be there. And in that assumption, my presence had been erased. I sat down on the sofa, letting the fabric catch under my hands. The dusk settled in, a pale gray light stretching across the room. I felt the ache of being quietly sidelined. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just listened to the house breathe with me. Each creak, each sigh, a reflection of the silence that had become my companion. The phone remained on the table. Screen dark. The conversations were over, but their weight lingered. Had questions, yes. But answers. They were all wrapped in careful silence, each one avoiding the edges of truth. Night fell slowly, pressing shadows into corners of the house I thought I knew. I moved to the front door, hand resting on the knob, feeling the cool metal against my palm. Outside, the world continued. Cars passing, dogs barking, the wind brushing leaves along the sidewalk. Inside, only the quiet. Deliberate. Measured. Waiting. I didn't open the door. I didn't call anyone else. I just let the silence settle, like a letter placed carefully beneath a drawer. Hidden but still present. Why had everyone decided I wasn't needed? I carried the question with me into the night, its edges sharp, but its answer still out of reach. And somewhere in that quiet, I knew. The story had only just begun. The closet door creaked when I opened it, soft but sharp in the silence of the house. Moonlight spilled through the window, touching the floorboards with a silver hush. Inside, the dress hung as it always had, untouched. A quiet witness. Its fabric smelled faintly of cedar and years, a scent that carried more than memory. It carried expectation. I reached out slowly, fingers brushing the folds, tracing the way I had smoothed it when she was little, when every promise felt like it could last forever. I remembered the day I had bought it. The store smelled of lavender and polish, the kind of air that made small moments feel eternal. She had sat on the counter beside me, tiny hands playing with the ribbon on my bag, and I promised her then, "When the day comes, I'll wear it for you." Back then it felt certain, natural, joyful. Now, the room felt colder than usual, the floorboards sighing under the weight of absence. I stood there in the quiet, listening to the house remember other days. Days when she ran across the yard, cheeks flushed with excitement, dragging me into her small adventures. I ran my hands along the fabric again, feeling the texture, the gentle pull of the seams. It was soft, but somehow heavier than I remembered. As if it carried the weight of a promise that had never been kept. The silence around me felt intentional, calculated. The house was still, waiting for me to realize something I wasn't yet ready to face. I thought about the wedding. The chairs lined in neat rows, the music starting, guests seated and me, nowhere. The memory pressed against my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, the dress still in my hands. Its ribbon caught the light, tiny threads shimmering, fragile but resolute. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander through all the conversations, all the pauses, all the smiles that didn't reach the eyes. I remembered her voice from years ago, soft and impatient. "Mom, I need to finish my homework." Or, "Mom, can you help me with this?" Every small brush of distance now replayed in my mind. The tiny moments accumulated into a quiet wall, separating us without fanfare, without words. I felt the hollow where the invitation should have been, and then I felt something heavier, the unspoken reason for my absence. The dress had waited, silent. And I realized it had waited for someone who would never come. I held it closer, letting the folds fall over my lap, thinking about promises, about expectations, about how small silences could grow into distance too wide to cross. I stood and walked slowly to the window, dress in hand. Outside, the moonlight illuminated the yard, where shadows stretched long, skeletal, as if they had been waiting for me too. I thought about the promise I had made. Not just a dress, not just a day. A declaration of love, of presence, of being there. And yet, here I was, alone, holding the very symbol of what had been quietly erased. Was it distance that had done this? Or something deeper, something left unresolved? A word, a glance, a misunderstanding turned permanent in the quiet assumption of others. The weight of it pressed against me. I let the dress fall gently onto the bed, the fabric whispering against the sheets. The room felt impossibly still. Even the moonlight seemed hesitant, as if it too was unsure how to illuminate this absence. I realized then that some promises live quietly, in shadow, waiting for recognition that may never come. And yet I could not set it aside. Not yet. Not until I understood why it had been left alone, forgotten, and why I had been left outside the doorway of her day. I placed the dress carefully back in the closet, its cedar scent lingering in the air, a reminder of what had been promised and what had been denied. I lingered in the doorway. The house exhaled quietly, floorboards settling, walls listening. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing leaves across the lawn, a gentle murmur that felt like a question. How had we drifted so quietly, so completely? Closed the closet door. Moonlight lingered across the floor, silver and patient. I did not turn on the lights. Some things remain in the shadows until they are ready to speak. And tonight I realized, the dress is patient. Was this absence about distance? Or something that could never be forgiven? The headlights cut through the evening fog, painting the road in long, narrow strips of yellow. I slowed as I reached the familiar curve, where her house sat quietly behind a row of maples. The windows glowed warmly, golden rectangles in the dusk, spilling light onto the front lawn. I pressed my hands lightly against the steering wheel. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. I could see her, at least I imagined I could, moving inside, laughter drifting through the glass, reaching out like something I once knew but no longer touched. I didn't move forward. I didn't knock. I just sat, caught between the road and the memory of a place that had once been mine. I remember the first time I saw this house years ago. We had driven past slowly, imagining what it might feel like to live behind its doors, to fill its rooms with our lives. The yard was bare then, unclaimed. Now, it hummed with activity I was not invited to join. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the leather press into my palms. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and winter approaching. The sound of distant traffic reached me muffled, almost polite, as if it too understood not to intrude. I thought about the invitation that never came, about the quiet assumption, the unspoken decision that I would not be part of this day. I replayed her voice in my mind, soft, distracted, careful. Had she ever meant for me to be there? Or had I always been excluded quietly, deliberately, like a page torn from a book before I could read it? The house seemed to breathe beneath the light, alive with a life I could no longer touch. And for the first time that evening, I noticed how loud the absence was. I drove slowly past the driveway. The front porch was empty, but inside, the glow suggested movement, laughter, conversation. Familiar shapes blurred behind curtains. I imagined her in the living room, arranging flowers or straightening the table. Maybe talking to someone whose presence had replaced mine. My chest tightened. The tires hummed against the asphalt as I let the car coast a little further. I could almost see her glancing at a photograph, or laughing at a joke I had never heard. I could hear voices that belonged to a world where my presence had been quietly erased. I wanted to stop, to knock, to say something. But something held me back. Not fear exactly, something softer, heavier. A realization that my arrival might only underline my absence. I wondered what version of me she had been told to forget. Had she imagined me angry, distant, unwilling? Or had the story been rewritten without me noticing, my role removed quietly, like a bookmark slipping out of place? I slowed even more, the car barely moving, shadows lengthening over the lawn. The world inside the house carried on, warm and bright, indifferent to the ache of someone waiting outside. I turned the wheel gently and began to pull away. The headlights traced the curve of the driveway one last time, illuminating the garden gnomes she had collected, the swing that still swayed from the breeze. I thought about all the small moments, the hugs, the shared cups of tea, the whispered advice, and how they had been replaced in her mind by silence or misunderstanding. Pang hit me. Not sharp, not dramatic, just present, quiet and persistent. I realized that no amount of presence now could undo the narrative already written. She had carried a version of me that suited her life, her choices, her circle. And in that version I was absent whether I wanted to be or not. The warmth inside the house contrasted with the chill pressing against my hands through the steering wheel. I felt both connected and removed at the same time, like looking at a photograph of a memory you can't quite touch. I understood then that the absence wasn't just a moment. It was a story that had begun long ago, quietly agreed upon by everyone around her. And in that quiet understanding, I felt both sorrow and release, tangled together like threads in the hem of a dress I had once promised to wear. The fog thickened as I drove away, headlights cutting narrow paths through gray. The windows behind me glowed softly, retreating into memory as the car carried me forward. I didn't look back again. Not yet. The road ahead was empty, but my mind was full. Of questions I could not yet voice. Of spaces I could not yet fill. The house remained behind me, a quiet reminder of the life I had once been part of, and the life I would have to witness from the outside. What had she been told about me? And how long had I been quietly forgotten? The road stretched ahead, and I pressed forward slowly, carrying the weight of absence like a companion I could not yet leave behind. The floorboards creaked as I walked through the hallway, a sound that felt louder than it should. The evening light filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the carpet. I paused at the doorway, hands resting lightly on the frame, letting the quiet settle around me. A memory surfaced, a word spoken too sharply, a glance misread, a door slammed in anger. It was a sound I had hoped to forget. But here it was again, curling around the edges of my thoughts. Took a breath. The house seemed to hold its own, listening as carefully as I did. Years ago, the argument had felt like a storm in a teacup. I had said things I didn't fully mean, words that cut sharper than I intended. Her small face, flushed and wide-eyed, had mirrored the confusion and hurt I felt myself. We had buried it afterward, under routines, under laughter, under small reconciliations. But tonight, with the house silent and the windows dark except for the fading glow of the streetlight, I wondered how that day had transformed. Memory, I realized, has a way of reshaping itself, leaving gaps, filling them with shadows that grow larger with time. I went to the living room, where old photographs leaned against the wall. Birthday cakes, school plays, smiles caught mid-laugh. I ran my fingers along the edge of one frame. The glass was cool. The past felt closer, tangible. And yet, I couldn't help but ask myself, had that single argument become something she carried as truth? Something that shaped her decision to exclude me from the wedding? The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen, shrill against the soft hum of the house. I ignored it. I was not thirsty for tea. I was thirsty for understanding. I sat in the armchair by the window, letting the soft evening air drift through the cracked pane. I recalled the argument in fragments, the words, the heat, the way my hands had gestured, pleading for understanding even as they trembled. I remembered her eyes, wide and certain, the way she had turned away before I could apologize. I imagined how she might have remembered it. Not the hesitation in my voice, not the sorrow behind my words, just the sharpness, the anger. Had my mistake grown larger in the telling? Had it become something she repeated silently to herself until it felt like the whole story? I thought about the times I had tried to reach out after that day. The lunches, the short calls, the notes tucked into her room. Were they meaningless now, overwritten by a memory shaped by silence and distance? I looked at the photograph on the table. Her smile was gentle, radiant. But I could almost see her lips pressed into lines I had never noticed before. Resistance, caution, mistrust. And suddenly, the absence of an invitation made sense, in a way I hadn't been ready to accept. I clenched my hands in my lap. The quiet around me pressed in. I realized the weight of a single day can stretch across years, bending truth to fit the shape of absence. I rose slowly, walking back through the hallway. The wallpaper felt rough under my fingertips, carrying the texture of years I had lived but also of years I had been misunderstood. I thought about all the unspoken conversations, the words left unsaid, the moments avoided for fear of conflict. I imagined my daughter, now grown, carrying that memory differently than I had intended. A single argument, a single misstep, amplified by time and silence, creating a story where I was not a mother who loved, but a presence to be wary of. I thought about how fragile memory can be, how easily it bends toward what we expect, what we fear, what we carry alone. And I understood, painfully, that the wedding had become the culmination of that bending. Her version of me had been shaped not by my intentions, but by a single echo of anger, left unchecked, left to grow. I sat back in the chair, letting the weight of that realization settle. No one had shouted. No one had made threats. But absence had a voice of its own. It had rewritten our story quietly, invisibly, while I slept or was distracted by life's demands. The kettle finally hissed its end, sharp and demanding. I turned it off and let the room settle again. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing the leaves against each other like whispered questions. I could see the shadows of the branches dancing against the wall, fragile, fleeting. I rose and walked to the window, pressing my palm lightly against the glass. I didn't know if she would ever understand my side of the story. I only knew that the weight of memory, hers, mine, ours, was real. And in that quiet, I whispered to the empty room. Did that day become the truth she lived with? And is it too late to change it? The house exhaled softly with me. And somewhere I knew the story had only just begun. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I pushed the dresser slightly to the side. A sliver of moonlight fell across the gap, illuminating something tucked beneath it. I knelt down, fingers brushing the dust, and found a folded envelope, edges curled and yellowed with time. The paper felt fragile, brittle, like a secret preserved against the years. I hesitated before opening it, aware that the words inside might be a door I wasn't ready to cross. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old laundry, a scent that made the silence feel heavier. I remembered the time she must have written it. A summer afternoon, maybe, when sunlight came weakly through the blinds, painting stripes on her bedroom floor. She was small then, hands trembling as she pressed the pen to paper, careful not to leave a mark that might betray her feelings. I'd never seen it, never held it, never read it. Somehow it had been left behind, hidden beneath a drawer, deliberately unseen. The air in the room seemed to pause with me, waiting. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the envelope in my lap, the weight of years pressing into my shoulders. I imagined her then, quiet, hesitant, unsure who to trust, unsure if her words would ever reach the right eyes. The house carried echoes of our distance, rooms empty of conversation, hallways that had once hummed with life, now silent. And now a letter, unseen, untouched, waiting for discovery. I unfolded the paper slowly, feeling the fibers give way beneath my fingers. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate, loops curling softly, the kind of writing that holds someone's entire heart in every stroke. The words weren't angry. They were afraid. Afraid of something I didn't yet understand. Afraid that my presence could hurt her, or that speaking out loud would change everything. I read her sentences twice. "Mom, I don't want to make you upset," she wrote. "I hope you understand. I just don't know how to say it." My chest ached, not from blame, but from the quiet fear that had lived in her so long, unspoken, unshared. I wondered who had made sure this letter stayed hidden. Who had tucked it beneath a drawer and left it there, keeping my eyes from reading the words meant for me. I ran my fingers along the folds again, tracing the curves of her letters as if touching them might bring her closer. I could almost hear her voice, soft and tentative, the weight of years tucked into every line. The room felt smaller, intimate, as if the letter had carried her presence into the quiet space. I breathed slowly, letting the words sink in, feeling the years of silence collapse around me. I thought about the distance between us, the unspoken gaps that had widened over time. The old arguments, the miscommunications, the pauses that never ended. This letter, hidden but real, revealed a truth that had been invisible. She had feared me, not blamed me. I held it closer, sensing the trembling in the lines, the care she had taken to preserve her thoughts without confrontation. And I realized someone had intervened. Someone had made sure I never saw it until now. Perhaps to protect, perhaps to control, perhaps to rewrite history. I sat back against the dresser, letting the silence fill the room. I imagined her hands writing those lines, unsure if they would ever reach me. I wondered who had taken that choice from her, the choice to speak, to connect, to bridge the gap between us. The fear in her words resonated, but so did something else, a hope that I would understand eventually. And I knew, as I traced the faded letters, that understanding would take more than a single night. It would take patience, reflection, And perhaps forgiveness, quiet and slow, like the turning of pages long neglected. I closed my eyes, the paper resting against my chest. The weight of her fear pressed gently, insistently, reminding me of the time lost and the time that remained. I placed the letter carefully on the dresser, letting the envelope remain unfolded just enough to hold the secret within. The moonlight shifted, touching the folds with a soft glow. Outside, the wind brushed the trees, carrying the faintest whisper through the open window. It sounded like a question. Who had shaped this silence? And why had it been left to linger so long? I stayed there a moment longer, the house listening with me, the shadows curling against the walls. I didn't move the dresser back. I didn't close the envelope. Some truths wait beneath drawers, beneath floors, beneath years. And some stories, I realized, are only beginning when we finally find them. Who made sure this letter stayed hidden? And what other quiet truths have waited all this time? The room was quiet, too quiet, as if the walls were holding their breath. I sat at the small kitchen table, a single lamp casting a soft halo over scattered papers and a half-empty cup of tea. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches, rattling the window panes like a soft, persistent question. I traced my finger along the edge of a photograph, trying to recall the exact moment everything had shifted. Pieces were missing. Gaps in memory that felt deliberate. And somewhere I knew a story had been written about me. A story I hadn't told. I sipped the tea. Warm, bitter, grounding. The quiet pressed in, patient and relentless. I began to remember. Small gestures, glances in passing, conversations half-heard at family gatherings. There were moments I hadn't thought much of. Words spoken in passing by relatives, friends, even neighbors. Moments that seemed ordinary then but now held weight. I could see how someone might have quietly stepped in on my behalf, shaping perception without confrontation. It wasn't malice. Not exactly. It was careful, subtle, an invisible hand rewriting intention into assumption. Her eyes, when she looked at me, had absorbed these whispers, these pauses, and filled in the blanks with certainty. I realized she had believed a version of me constructed in absence. A mother who had distanced herself, who had refused or ignored, who had perhaps never cared. The house seemed to lean closer, listening as I pieced together these fragments. I felt the weight of omissions, the silences that spoke louder than words ever could. The story that had taken root in her mind wasn't shouted. It was simply left uncorrected, rehearsed quietly by all the small voices around her, until she accepted it as truth. I went through the motions, walking the rooms, recalling details I had overlooked. A comment from a neighbor about her mother always being busy. A brief smile, too quick, when a cousin mentioned a family gathering I had skipped. A pause, a shift, a hesitation in someone else's voice that made an innocent story feel like judgment. And I realized how patiently this narrative had been constructed. Not one person had yelled, not one person had confronted, but the silence had been orchestrated with precision. I saw my daughter's face in my mind. Quiet, hesitant, believing I had chosen distance, believing I had been absent by choice rather than by circumstance. I wondered how many moments had been quietly reinterpreted. How long had this version of me been rehearsed, repeated, layered with careful suggestions and unchallenged assumptions? I walked to the window and looked out at the yard, moonlight brushing the tops of the trees. Everything seemed familiar, yet somehow altered, as if the world had shifted slightly while I wasn't looking. The quiet became heavier, pressing against me like a room full of unspoken words. I sank into the chair by the window, clutching a photograph, the edges worn from fingers long past. It hit me. She had never known the truth, not because I hadn't tried to show it, but because the narrative she was given had been so convincing. My intentions had been rewritten in silence. My love had been edited into absence. I remembered times I had reached out, gently, with calls, letters, small gestures of care. How easily they could have been overlooked or reframed as part of the story others had told. I realized the truth had always existed quietly alongside the false narrative, but it had no voice of its own. The weight of it was almost physical. I could feel the years of misunderstanding pressing into my chest. I thought about her, believing in a mother shaped not by reality but by a carefully built story, practiced by others around her, layer upon layer, until no one could distinguish fact from fiction. I understood, in a quiet and almost painful clarity, that repairing this would take more than words. It would take time, presence, patience, and the gentle unraveling of a story that had been meticulously woven. The lamp on the table flickered briefly, casting the room in shadow and light, reminding me how fragile clarity could be. I placed the photograph back on the table, letting the memories and realizations settle like dust in the quiet. Outside, the wind continued to move through the trees, persistent, patient, asking questions I did not yet have answers to. I took a deep breath and leaned back in the chair, listening to the house exhale with me. The story wasn't finished. The silence wasn't absolute. And I knew, finally, that understanding would come slowly, quietly, like a sunrise creeping across the floorboards. How long had this story been rehearsed? And will she ever know the truth beneath the silence? The light softened. The room held its breath. And somewhere in the quiet, the truth waited patiently, ready to speak. I scrolled slowly through my phone, though I already knew what I would find. The screen glowed in the darkened room, a pale rectangle of light on my lap. Her face appeared first, radiant, smiling, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and makes the whole room glow. Behind her, people I recognized and people I barely remembered stood clustered together. Laughter frozen in glossy pixels. And then I saw it. The empty space where I should have been. No one pointed it out. No one mentioned it. But the absence was visible, almost loud, in the careful composition of the photographs. I set the phone down, letting the quiet fill the room, a soft pressure against my chest. The living room smelled faintly of old wood and winter air, the faint echo of evening spent here long ago. I sank into the armchair, thinking about the months leading up to this day. Conversations that had never happened, questions that had remained unanswered. I remembered the invitations I never received, the silences that had grown heavier with each passing week. Now, looking at the images, I realized the wedding hadn't started my absence. It had only confirmed it. The people around her smiled for the camera, oblivious to the gap left unfilled. My daughter's eyes sparkled in the photographs, and yet, I could see the story that had been told to her, one in which I had chosen distance, one in which my presence was unnecessary. I traced her face with my eyes, as though touching the image could bridge the space between us. And I understood that absence has a shape. It leaves an imprint that no one needs to comment on to make real. I studied the photographs more closely. Each image held its own small story. Her bouquet cradled carefully, a glance exchanged with a friend, the folding of hands at the ceremony. And everywhere a space, sometimes subtle, sometimes glaring, where I would have stood, a frame left empty. I noticed the careful placement of family, how shoulders leaned into each other, how smiles curved inwards, forming circles I could not join. No one seemed aware of the gap. The world had moved on without me. And yet, my absence spoke louder than the smiles, louder than the flowers, louder than the laughter caught mid-frame. I remembered the words of old friends, the subtle comments that had shaped perception, the quiet influence that rewrote my intentions. Each photograph now carried that invisible story, one of omission, rehearsed and reinforced over time. I wanted to reach through the screen, to place my hand on her shoulder, to reclaim the space that had quietly vanished. But the images were final, solid, untouchable, and I felt the weight of years pressing into me, heavy and silent. I put the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the memory of her laughter at past birthdays, past achievements, past ordinary evenings flood in. It hit me then. The wedding was not a beginning. It was the confirmation of a narrative that had been building long before, constructed in whispers, assumptions, and omissions. I thought about the empty spaces in the photographs, not just physical but emotional. I had been erased, not in anger, not in conflict, but through careful absence, through small omissions no one noticed. And now, looking at these frozen moments, I wondered, Was it too late to step back into the frame? Could a story that had been rehearsed for years be rewritten by a single act of presence? Or had the frame already hardened around absence? The light from the phone reflected in the glass of the picture frame on the mantel. An old photograph of her as a child, smiling up at me. The contrast was unbearable and tender all at once. I realized that time had not erased love. It had only tested it, quietly, deliberately. I rose and walked to the window, staring out at the empty street, lit faintly by the street lamp. The wind moved gently through the trees, rustling leaves in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. I thought about her, about the life she was living now, about the circle I had been left outside. I touched the glass of the window, imagining reaching her through it, across distance and misunderstanding. And I knew, in that quiet, still moment, that absence has a voice, but presence has power too, if one finds the courage to step forward, slowly, softly, without expectation. The photographs lay on the table, bright and permanent. And somewhere in the hush of the night, I whispered to the empty room, "Is it too late to step back into the frame? Or has the story only just begun?" The light of the street lamp flickered, and I waited, listening for the answer that would come in time. The doorbell rang softly, almost shyly, echoing through the quiet of the early evening. I stood on the porch, hands gripping the edges of the railing, feeling the weight of years pressing into my shoulders. The sky was bruised with twilight, the last traces of sun lingering like a memory that wouldn't fade. I could hear her laughter faintly from inside the house, warm, unguarded, a sound that made my chest ache and my knees weak at once. I swallowed and rang the bell again, slower this time, deliberate, as if each chime could carry my intention. "I want to speak." The door opened, and there she was, radiant and hesitant all at once. Her eyes searched mine, and I knew this was the moment we had both been avoiding. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten her breakfasts, done her homework, and spilled countless secrets into my listening ears. Now the room felt too large, the silence heavy with years of unspoken words. I could feel the tension in her hands, folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale in the soft glow of the overhead light. I took a deep breath, letting it ground me. "Can we talk?" I asked quietly, careful to let the words carry their weight without breaking. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening, and I realized that this conversation was as much about her as it was about me. I thought of the wedding, the invitations I never received, the photographs where I had been absent, and the letters that had been hidden from me. All of it had created a narrative, a version of me she had believed in, shaped by omission, rehearsed by others, carried in silence. And now, finally, the truth could begin to speak. The first words were tentative, fragile, as if testing the waters. I thought you didn't want to come," she said, voice small, breaking slightly. The pause that followed was filled with everything we had left unsaid over the years. Missed birthdays, quiet dinners, unreturned calls. I reached across the table, brushing my hand lightly against hers, feeling the tremor beneath her skin. "I never chose distance," I whispered. "I never wanted to be away from you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head gently. "But I believed it," she said, voice cracking. "I believed that you didn't care. That you had given up on being part of my life." We sat in silence for a long moment, the room holding our words like fragile glass. I thought about all the ways misunderstanding had grown roots between us, how carefully built stories had overwritten reality. And yet, here she was, sitting with me, letting the truth in, even if only a sliver at a time. I watched her, studying the lines of her face, the slight quiver of her lips, the way her shoulders slumped with the weight of years of assumption. It was both heartbreaking and tender, seeing her realize that the version of me she had carried in her mind was not the truth. I spoke next, my voice steady, slow, deliberate, carrying the years of longing and regret. "I never stopped loving you. Every time I called and didn't reach you, every letter I wrote and never sent. It was never because I didn't care." She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for a moment, letting the weight of my words settle. I didn't know," she admitted softly. I didn't know. And I guess I didn't ask. I let myself believe the story I was told. We sat together in that quiet kitchen, the air heavy with the echo of missed chances. The conversation wasn't easy. Every truth seemed wrapped in layers of regret, every admission laced with quiet sorrow. Yet with each sentence, each pause, we began to unravel the years of misunderstanding, slowly, gently. I thought of the letters beneath the drawer, the photographs, the empty spaces, all the evidence of absence. And yet, here she was, finally willing to hear what had been true all along. Her hand found mine again, tighter this time. "I wish I had known sooner," she whispered, voice barely audible. "So much sooner." And I realized that sometimes, truth doesn't need to arrive early to be powerful. Even late, it can reach across the years, into the hollow spaces carved by silence. The light in the kitchen softened, the shadows folding into the corners of the room like gentle witnesses. We sat together, hands touching, words no longer necessary for a moment. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint sound of a bird calling into the night. It felt like a beginning, tentative and fragile, but real. I knew the damage of years of quiet misunderstanding couldn't vanish instantly. But sitting there with her, listening to her voice, feeling her presence, I understood that repair could begin. And in that soft, luminous silence, I whispered to myself, and perhaps to her as well, "Truth has arrived finally. Will it be enough to heal the spaces left behind?" The house breathed with us, the night folding around our words, carrying hope quietly into the dark. The sky was pale, almost silver when I left her house. Dawn had not fully come, but the first light brushed the rooftops like a tentative caress. The street was quiet, almost reverent, and I felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. The door closed softly behind me, and for the first time in years, I walked away without the weight of misunderstanding pressing my shoulders down. The air smelled of frost and damp earth, carrying the faint scent of winter flowers still clinging to the garden. I paused, letting it sink in, this quiet that was not emptiness, but something softer, attentive. Somehow, it felt like the beginning of something I had waited a lifetime to touch. Returning home, the familiar creak of my front steps was comforting, grounding. The house smelled like old pine and faintly of the breakfast I hadn't made yet. Everything was the same, yet everything had shifted beneath the surface. I thought of her, sitting across from me at the table, eyes glistening, voice trembling, letting truth unfold slowly, carefully, like a fragile thread through the years. It hadn't been a dramatic revelation. No shouting, no accusations, just quiet words, long pauses, and the weight of unspoken understanding. We hadn't fixed everything. Some damage, some gaps remain. But the silence between us had changed. It no longer concealed or judged. It listened. And that alone felt like a kind of healing. Slow, deliberate, without fanfare. I walked through my rooms, touching familiar surfaces. The worn edge of the dining table, the soft fabric of the armchair, the old bookshelf lined with books whose pages smelled of memory. Everything felt alive, present, as if the house itself had waited for this day. I sat by the window, letting the light wash over me, and thought of the past months, years really, of absence and quiet misunderstanding. Each photograph, each letter, each carefully built story of omission replayed in my mind. I realized that those absences had left a shape in our lives, a pattern formed by silence rather than words. But now the edges of that pattern were softening. I could see her face clearly in my mind, not as the daughter who had misunderstood me, but as the one who had grown, shaped by her own fears and assumptions. And I saw myself differently too. Not perfect, not blameless, but present, willing to step into the frame finally. I touched the window glass lightly, imagining her sitting across from me once more, her eyes searching mine, her hand brushing against mine. And I understood that repair doesn't come all at once. It comes in moments, in the quiet attention we pay to what remains, in the space we leave for truth to breathe. The light changed subtly, shadows shifting across the room. I thought about what grows in cleared ground, in soil turned over and open to air and light. Not everything would bloom immediately, but something could begin. Something new, tentative, and real. I moved through the house, touching objects that carried memory. The old quilt folded neatly on the couch, the letters I had finally read, the photographs that once held absence now soft with possibility. Every object seemed to hum with quiet testimony, reminding me that nothing disappears completely. Truth remains, even if buried. I remembered our conversation earlier. Her voice breaking, my own steady, careful words threading between us. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain everything to justify the past. I simply listened as she spoke, and in listening, the years of misunderstanding began to unravel. The garden outside beckoned, frost sparkling on the edges of the leaves, tiny diamonds catching the morning light. I stepped outside, feeling the ground beneath my feet, firm but receptive. And I realized that silence, once oppressive, had become fertile. It had opened a space where truth could take root, where possibility could grow. I didn't rush. I didn't demand immediate healing or reconciliation. I let the quiet do its work, letting the memory of absence soften, letting the understanding settle into the corners of my heart. For the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened. Not because the world had corrected itself, but because the truth had finally been given room to exist. I returned to my chair by the window, watching the sun rise slowly, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The house seemed to exhale, its walls holding the quiet, its floors remembering the footsteps of both the past and the present. Some wounds would need time to fully mend. Some gaps would remain, delicate and tender, reminders of what had been lost and found. But for now I could breathe. The heaviness had lifted. The silence no longer hid. It listened, patient and gentle, carrying the promise of new beginnings. I touched the quilt on the couch, fingers tracing the stitches, thinking of her and the conversation we'd shared. The future felt uncertain, yes, but alive, ready to grow from the cleared ground beneath it. And in that soft, radiant morning light, I whispered to myself, "This is what remains. And perhaps from here anything can grow." The floor creaked gently as I rose, the house welcoming me home, ready for what comes next.